The NZBC presents The Moa, a spectrum documentary about New Zealand's extinct flightless bird. The programme is introduced by Jack Perkins.
The Moa story is fascinating to the scientist, romantic to the general public, and a godsend to the practical joker. And all these elements find a place in this necessarily brief programme. The romance lies in the neat detective work of Professor Richard Owen, a noted English anatomist with a specialised knowledge of bone structure. Early visitors to New Zealand had found Moa bones in the 1830s, and one of them at least, Joel Pollock, author, artist and trader, had a pretty good idea of their origin and significance. But it was Owen's calm, considered assessment that really made the Moa known to the world at large. After carefully examining a broken femur, or leg bone, that was shown to him in 1839, Richard Owen made his famous pronouncement.
There once existed, and perhaps still exists in New Zealand, a race of Strutheus birds of larger and more colossal size than the ostrich, or any known species.
Strutheus meaning ostrich-like. As more bones became available, Professor Owen continued his research into the Moa, finally presenting his conclusions in 2 large volumes. In the public mind, the word Moa became synonymous with the largest birds in the group. These were often reconstructed as models, usually with the backbone sloping up at an angle of 30 or 40 degrees, legs vertical and neck held erect to gain every inch of height. Under these conditions, the largest Moa, Dinornis maximus, could be stretched to a height of 12 feet and made a highly impressive model. He was considered a necessity at every New Zealand exhibition and even found his way overseas to the Great Wembley exhibition of 1924. Today, models are given a more relaxed attitude, with the backbone closer to the horizontal and the neck more looped. Even under these conditions, Dinornis is an astonishing creature, 8 feet high. But not all Moas were in the heavyweight class. As Dr. R.A. Faller indicates, the term Moa includes quite a wide group of birds.
Most authorities agree on about 19 different kinds, and they are clearly divisible into 5 genera, which really meant that there were 5 different sorts of birds, all of a rather similar structure. They ranged from a full-grown bird of the smallest species at about 3 feet 6 standing height to birds which were well over 10 feet. And not only was it a matter of difference in height, but the proportions of the legs to the rest of the body. There were 2 groups which were extraordinarily wide in the beam with very short, thick legs, and they must have looked more like penguin caricatures than striding birds.
Now, how did they reach New Zealand?
Biologists are divided in opinion. It's fairly general or fairly popular theory that a bird so heavy and with no vestige of external wings must have moved about by walking, and in the various theories of land connections, which ties the present New Zealand landmass up with, first of all, a chain of contiguous islands in an archipelago, and finally with a Southeast Asian continent, it's been customary to assume that the birds simply walked along until the bridges were down behind them and they were left here. But the anatomy of the bird and the history of flightless birds everywhere makes it more likely that their ancestors flew and in fact could have flown to the detached landmass which is now New Zealand.
So that once here they seem to have changed fairly rapidly to fill a rather specialised ecological niche.
This is undoubtedly the case. As evidence has accumulated about their habits, it's clear that they were largely vegetarian feeders, that they were almost omnivorous in feeding not only on grass but on leaves and twigs and anything that they could crop with their very heavy bills. And in a country which is notable for the luxuriance of its vegetation and the variety of it, they must have had a tremendously developed at least an untouched field of opportunity. And there has been almost certainly a very rapid evolution of size to cope with the wonderful opportunities of nourishment. And along with this rapid development of size, there was a corresponding loss, first of all, of flight, and finally, in the case of most of the moas, but not all of them, of the wings themselves.
Over what period of time did moas exist in New Zealand?
This is an interesting question, because the number of clearly fossil remains that can be identified as to era and period are very, very few. The first of them, rather sparse in number and not distinguishable from the modern, common moa bones, in other words, they're the regular species, were first found in rock in the South Island, put down to Miocene. The Miocene, of course, was some 20 or 30 million years ago, but the greater bulk of the moas are in the early recent and the late Pleistocene, which of course is within 500,000 years.
From the sheer number of moa remains, and they occur almost from North Cape to Stewart Island, there must have been extremely large concentrations of the birds. Great flocks of moas browsing the tussock or striding open country at the forest margin must have been an astonishing sight to the earliest Polynesian visitors to New Zealand. If it was once so abundant, why did the moa become extinct? The neatest, most concise explanation comes not from a scientist, but from the humorist Mark Twain, who visited New Zealand in 1895.
The moa was a wonderful bird. As far as flying was concerned, it never really got off the ground, but it had a good turn of speed on the flat. It would make 40 miles an hour and still come out reasonably fresh, and they used it in the country districts for carrying the mails. It was still in existence when the railway was introduced into New Zealand and still carrying the mails. The railway company exterminated the moa to get the mails.
Scientists are by nature cautious men, and it's safe to say that Mark Twain's theory doesn't meet with their full approval. Dr. Fowler has a more considered explanation.
The extinction factors could have been slowly changing climate. After all, there was an ice age. In fact, there were two within the period over which the moas spread. And they would, in the case of the first interglacial, have had a very restricted amount of area. But they appear to have survived that. In the later one, with the development of the last post-glacial period, there were long periods of drought, there were changes in the vegetation, and this must have altered the balance of numbers of moas and possibly predisposed them in many ways to ultimate extinction, which clearly had its final phase with the coming of man. And here was a bird relatively defenseless, singularly vulnerable to such methods of land clearing as burning, which we now know rather belatedly in the study of New Zealand history, was carried out by the Maori people on a very big scale.
Islands like New Zealand, because of their isolation, often have what we could call ecological vacancies, not found in the older landmasses. New forms tend to change their characteristics to fill these vacancies, but in becoming specialised, they're less able to tolerate any disturbance to their habitat. They're less adaptable. And so the moa had to pay the price. When did the last species of moa become extinct? There are good grounds for believing that it was after Europeans came to New Zealand. Sealers around the southwest coast of the South Island spoke of a large bird they called the fireman, from the rattling noise it produced. At that period, the late 18th and early 19th century, the English fireman used a wooden rattle as a warning signal. Possibly then this particular type of moa, Megalapteryx, made a sound something like this. As the voice of a bush mower, that reconstruction is pure guesswork, of course, based on the slimmest evidence. One or two stories of encounters with bush mowers come from the densely forested Buller district, when gold prospectors penetrated the area in the 1860s. For the most part, the stories are sketchy. By far the most interesting European account is that of the late Alice Mackenzie. The Mackenzies came to the ill-fated settlement in Jackson's Bay in South Westland, and after a brief stay moved further south in 1876 to Martin's Bay, where they built what was probably the most isolated homestead in New Zealand. In September 1959, then at the age of 86, Alice Mackenzie recorded an interview from a hospital bed in Dunedin. She still possessed a highly accurate memory, and the recording she made is now historic.
It was in the winter time, bright sunny day in winter time. I suppose that's why it was lying on the sand, sunning itself.
Was it in the bush?
No, just outside the bush line. The flax grows in the sand just outside the bush, and it was lying under this flax. And it took no notice of me when I came near it. And I got nearer and nearer until I sat down on the sand behind it. And I remember stroking its back, and it had no tail. And
did it object to your stroking it?
no, it just lay there. It was quite quiet. So I put my hand underneath it and drew out one of its legs. And then it took no notice of me at first, and I started to tie the flax round it. I thought I'd tie it up. And then it got up and made a harsh grunting cry and bit at me. And I ran as hard as ever I could. I was barefoot, I know, at the time, and I ran as hard as I could over the sandhills towards the sea. I thought if I got down to the sea that it mightn't follow me into the water. And I never looked behind, but it never came very far with me. When I went home, I told my father, and he came to have a look, but the bird was gone when he came. But he saw its tracks where it had followed me to the top of the sandhills, but it didn't go over them.
Did the tracks suggest a large bird?
Yes, he had a foot rule in his pocket, and he measured from the heel to the point of the middle toe was 11 inches. But he said in the soft sand it would sink and appear perhaps larger than the impression really was.
Was the mower ever seen at other times?
No, its tracks was every winter on the beach. I saw it again when I was about 17, and I was round by the Kaipo River, and I was driving some cattle around the beach, and when I came round a rocky point, the cattle were standing on the beach looking towards the bush, looked startled looking, and I looked up and I saw a bluish thing disappearing into the bush, and there was prisoners working at Milford Sound at the time, and I thought it was some escaped prisoner, and I got very frightened. But I had to go past the place to get home, and as I came along, I saw these tracks go into the bush, and then I knew what it was.
It is very hard to fault this account. Dr. Geoffrey Orbell, who rediscovered the Nautornis, finds it completely convincing.
Sir George Grey was round in Preservation Inlet in 1863, and he recorded in his journal of that time that he was given a circumstantial account of the recent killing of a small moa, one of a band of 6 or 8. He was given that account by some Maoris he met at Preservation Inlet, and I think if there were Maoris and moas in Preservation Inlet in 1863, it's highly probable that what Mrs. Mackenzie saw was very definitely a moa and couldn't have been anything else. I have read in her father's diary the size of the prints that were made in the sand, seen his actual measurements as written down by him in the diary at the time that he made them, and I think that anybody who queries the possibility of it being a moa is just, wouldn't know a moa if they saw one.
And Dr. Faller agrees.
Well, the smallest of the moas of which we have remains is known scientifically as Megalapteryx, which really means a big kiwi, but the bird was in fact a little moa. It stood about 3 feet high, was more agile, in other words, had a more graceful skeletal structure than most of the other moas, and would appear to have been very common in southwest Otago, around the fjords, in the mountain regions of northwest Nelson, and in central Otago. It was a bush moa, a forest moa, and its remains, when found in limestone caves or in limestone dust, have proved to be remarkably fresh. Quite a number were found in caves in which the skin and feathers were still attached, and the beak casing was on, the scales were on the legs. In fact, there was just a dried-up mummy, the last good one that was so found. This is, I think, almost certainly the bird which was still surviving in small pockets of country, as the takahe does today, in the southwest. And this is the bird which she saw.
She describes a blue colour to the feathers. Now, you yourself have found feathers of Megalapteryx, I believe. How do they square with her account?
Well, remarkably well, and surprisingly so. The feathers which we dug out some years ago from an accumulation of limestone dust in a rock shelter where hunters had in fact made their fire, the charcoal was still there, and the charred bones of a Megalapteryx which they had cooked were still in the fireplace. The hunters' sandals were there, the charred sticks, all the rest of it. And in the dust at the side, where the bird presumably had been plucked or other moas had died, were perfectly fresh feathers. And their colour was a dark blackish purple or purplish black, fringed on the faded edges with a golden brown. And one could well imagine that a bird covered with quite well-structured feathers of that kind would have presented a fairly glossy and basically bluish-black appearance, perhaps rather like the New Guinea cassowary today.
If in fact Megalapteryx survived in the 1880s, did it linger on into the 20th century? There is some possibility at least that it did. Jules Berg was a Swede who lived a solitary existence at Long Beach in Preservation Inlet. On one occasion, and unfortunately we have no date for this, he was travelling overland to Milford in company with another well-known figure of South Westland, Arrawata Bill. In the course of the journey, he saw what he believed to be a group of bush mowers. He later told the story to Mr. T.A. Clark, from whose written account these details are drawn.
One night, he told me, they camped some 15 miles from Lake Widgeon, at the head of the inlet, about 4,000 feet up. It was November, and the weather was good. The campsite was about 50 feet above a stream which cascaded into a moss-lined pool. During the night, Jules woke suddenly, looked at his watch, noted that the time was 3:35. Then he heard from the stream nearby a sound like deer taking water, and he was wide awake. It looked like a good opportunity to bag a couple, so he took his rifle and his torch and set off. In the first light of dawn, he could just see the outline of the waterhole. He got into position slowly to take a snap shot at what he thought was a deer. The torch fitted along the barrel of his rifle and flashed on as he took first pressure. And in full view, there were 3 objects like giant fowls, each standing about 4 feet. Later he measured the height against the rock background. He'd never seen anything like them before, and for a moment he was stupefied. In that instant, the birds fled. Jules assured me that he wasn't dreaming that night, because at daylight he and Arrawata Bill went down to the stream, and there on the banks were the footprints of the giant birds.
It's possible then that Jules Berg was the last to see a Megalapteryx, though others have laid claim to that distinction. There's an account from Murchison in 1940, when a woman saw what she thought was a bush mower near the Buller River. Her testimony was supported by the local cream truck driver. Another report came from geologists working near Boulder Lake in the northwest Nelson district in the mid-1950s. But if the facts of 20th century sightings have been a trifle meagre, there's always been somebody with imagination enough to fill in a few details. The moa is God's gift to the hoaxer, and practical jokers in New Zealand have risen admirably to the challenge. As on the 8th of January 1919, when the Christchurch Weekly Press ran an extraordinary story under the headlines,
Cornered by a Moa, an amazing adventure in the Urawira country.
There followed a story not dissimilar to Conan Doyle's The Lost World. In the course of a journey through the Urawira country, the writer had been deserted by his Maori guide during an intense electrical storm. He blundered on through the bush, and eventually, clambering down a cliff face, found himself trapped in a sunken valley. What happened next would have been incredible, but for the obvious honesty of the writer and the wealth of detail he supplied. And what did in fact happen?
While retracing my steps along the foot of the cliffs, I was startled by the hurried rush of heavy footsteps, and before I had time to wheel around, was knocked sprawling. I fell heavily forward and was half stunned by the violence with which I struck the ground. In a semi-conscious condition, I felt a terrific clawing on my back that tore off my knapsack and water flask and ripped through my clothes deep into my flesh. I attempted to rise to my feet, but a blow on the back of my head, like the tap of a sledgehammer, dazed me, and I again pitched helplessly forward. This time I tumbled into a shallow niche under the cliff, which undoubtedly saved my life. Instinctively, I crawled further into the recess, and found myself in a sort of natural miniature cave-like indentation, where I lay, for how long I have no idea, until my scattered senses returned.
Safe under the overhang, he peers out.
I shall never forget the surprising spectacle that met my gaze. I saw what looked like a gigantic ostrich, though lighter in colour and without the elegant wing plumes, rearing its head fully 14 feet from the ground. I realized with a thrill of excitement that what I saw before me was a specimen of the supposedly extinct moa. It is impossible to describe the strange emotions I experienced as I surveyed this survivor of a monstrous race. As the bird stooped occasionally to peck and kick at my knapsack that lay on the ground some 30 feet away, I observed every detail of its appearance. It was of a light brownish colour, varying to reddishness on the sides. The body was bulky, but with no vestige of wings. The legs were disproportionately massive, in fact almost elephantine, and the three-toed feet were similarly ponderous. The head was rather smaller than would be expected for a bird of its dimensions, and was set upon a fairly thick and long ostrich-like neck. The moa emitted an angry, deep, booming-like grunt, resembling somewhat that of a bittern, which was uncanny in the extreme. I noted the powerful build of the bird and wondered at my escape.
There were still problems in store for our traveller. He goes down to the river to drink, after the moa had disappeared. But it's a remarkably persistent creature and returns to attack him, knocking him into the river. Only half conscious, he's carried down the rapids and over a 40-foot waterfall before he staggers ashore, where he's found and looked after by a shepherd. A story like this is a newspaper editor's delight, and the overseas press seized on it happily, running it under banner headlines, which added a few feet to the moa's height for good measure.
Battled for life with a bird 20 feet high. Science discusses the amazing encounter of an English explorer with a supposedly extinct moa, and prepares to send an expedition to investigate his story.
In actual fact, the explorer was Ivan M. Levy, a Wellington journalist with a lively imagination and a wicked sense of humour, and this story was merely the first part of his hoax. Levy had already hinted in his article that there was more to come. Now he invented an elaborate expedition to capture the moa alive and bring it in triumph to Wellington. And in fact the moa was duly captured, and the party were returning with it through the bush when they were overtaken by a forest fire. Sadly, they had to free the moa, and jettisoned even their precious movie film to escape the flames. They emerged from the bush with nothing more tangible than the memory of those few incredible days. Levy ends with a plea to the settlers of the district, and here, for the one and only time, his tongue is plainly in his cheek.
Professor J, has just requested me to announce that if any settler should come across a vagrant moa standing 14 feet in its bare feet, he would be greatly obliged if the finder could communicate promptly with the Secretary of the Ornithological Society, Wellington.
But nobody did. Every bit as ingenious but totally different in concept was the great moa hoax of the early 1950s. And in this case we have a first-hand account from the hoaxer himself, Mick Neville of Kumara on the west coast.
An old friend of mine had a skeleton given to him that was picked up on the Greenstone Creek. He made drawings of it and measurements, and he sent it to Dr. Fowler at Christchurch Museum. Dr. Fowler writes back and tells him it's the skeleton of a sheep. It upset the old chap quite a lot because it didn't even look like a sheep. So he sent it to Sydney Museum, and they wrote back and told him they couldn't understand him sending it there when Dr. Fowler was such a clever man in New Zealand. Referred him back to Dr. Fowler. So I decided to pull Dr. Fowler's leg. So never seen a moa in my life, but I made a set of feet with toes. 3 toes, as I thought a bird would have. And I put them on a pair of shoes, and I went down one morning and I walked on the bed of sand under the Teremakau River bridge. Later on in the day, I asked the old chap what the prints of an albatross were like. And he couldn't understand that. He said an albatross couldn't land here. Well, I said there's bird marks under the bridge, and they're not a pukeko or a duck. So he came down to have a look. And of course, that settled the thing. I had to rush home and get plaster cast and plaster of Paris and made casts. Most of the town people went down to have a look, and they decided that the moa was there. This old chap, the only thing he noticed was there was nothing to show where the bird had been feeding. So I went back and took the wife's salad tongs, metal salad tongs, hammered them into shape, sharpened them up, went down and nibbled a few pieces out of the toot bushes and left them lying around. A day or so afterwards, he hadn't noticed any bird droppings. Well, that was a job for the mincer, plus a shovelful or two of fowl manure, some leaves, grass, whatnot. Then it was pushed through a piece of hose with an ottle on the end, like a biscuit forcer, and we made the droppings. It was on the overseas news that night. The moa had been hadn't been seen, but had been walking.
I reminded Dr. Fowler of this story. He laughed as he recalled it. An excellent hoax, he said. The same sort of thing on a miniature scale, of course, as the famous hoax of the Piltdown skull. A nice example of West Coast ingenuity. I asked the question that had to be put to the doctor. Might someone, in fact, and not in fancy, see a moa? Could it still survive in some forgotten corner?
Well, a few years ago, I should have been almost optimistic. Now, I think one can hardly be sanguine about this because in recent years there has been increased opening up of this country. The meat hunters with helicopters have landed shooters here and there in the most remote fastnesses. There's no doubt that trampers and cross-country traverse people have been much more on the lookout, and hope seems to be fading, and I would reluctantly have to say that I think the chances are very remote.
That was The Moa, a Spectrum documentary about New Zealand's extinct flightless bird. The programme was narrated by Jack Perkins and written and produced by Alwyn Owen for the Spoken Features section of the NZBC.